Today we continue in this series that we started a couple weeks ago on the Ten Commandments. So if this is your first time here at Curtis Lake Church or first time in a long time, welcome to week number 3, where we're actually going to talk about the 6th commandment. That's right. We kind of took the first 4 in week number 1, and last week we talked about number 5. Today we're going to talk about one, and there's a memory verse for you to memorize. It's going to be so easy. It's just a couple words. How about that, huh? In this series, we're looking at the commandments that God gave us when He was establishing a people for Himself, right? Remember that God, He took this nation of people out from captivity and bondage and slavery, and He formed this covenant with them and gave them these commandments that were going to help them to understand, like, what does this mean to actually be in relationship with God? So like we talked about in the first week, the first 4 commandments related specifically to how people were going to live in fellowship with God. Like, how does this relationship with God work? And so God issued those commands. You can check that out in our media archives if you didn't get a chance to catch that one. And then last week, we started on the next segment, the last 6 of the 10 Commandments. They have a sort of a political sort of sense to them. That is, they help us to understand, how do we live in society with one another? Because we're not just these fragmented, individualistic people that are going to, figure out how to live in complete isolation from everyone else. We're gonna gather together in communities and towns and cities. We're ultimately going to form a nation. So how do we live among and with one another, given that there are going to come times when my desires are going to be in conflict with the desires of someone else? And so that first commandment had to do with the basic unit of society, which is the family. And the commandment was this: it was honor your father and your mother. Now, this next one that we're going to talk about today seems kind of obvious. In fact, it seems super obvious, right? Like almost as if you might read it and say, well, that kind of goes without saying, because there would, for the most part, be pretty common agreement among all human beings with regard to the importance of this commandment. But while it may be obvious, we still have to state the obvious. When I was in high school, 11th grade, I transferred to this other school, and I had this English teacher. In this class that I was taking, there was a lot of reading and a lot of writing, just lots and lots of paper writing. And for the most part, my papers were written well enough to get a good grade, but there was this one thing that my teacher kept on sort of reprimanding me about. If there was any red ink, it wasn't necessarily for spelling or for grammar or for even providing a persuasive argument for whatever it is that I was trying to talk about. The problem usually came down to this thing, and he'd write in these words on my paper. He'd say, "State the obvious." Somewhere along the way, I had sort of kind of forgotten to actually bring out what it was that I was talking about. As obvious as it may have seemed to me, it was still necessary to state the obvious. And that's certainly one of the things I think that we can understand here from this commandment. So let's look at it. Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, just 3 words, okay? Everybody can memorize this one. You can say, I memorized a verse of the Bible this week. All right, here it is. Exodus 20, verse 13. Do not murder. Obvious, right? All right, everybody on board with that one? Right? Do not murder. Now, before we talk about that, just imagine if no such law existed. Right? Just imagine if you lived in a society where that wasn't necessarily understood to be a law that was to govern the people of that society. Right? In that case, people would have the ability to take the life of another person simply because they had the power or the opportunity to do so. And think about the result of that. If that was the kind of society in which we lived, where those who had the power or the opportunity to take life as they desired to, think about how much fear we would have. The constant paranoia, right? Every time you left your house, walked down the street, went into the marketplace, wondering, Was today going to be the day that somebody more powerful than you, or for whatever reason they wanted to, decided to take your life? Imagine the great extremes that we would go to ensure our self-preservation. There would be only civil unrest. Like, that would be the common experience of every one of us. You see, if society is going to thrive, the people of that society must have a high regard for life, right? Every society has sort of taken that for granted to some degree. Now, they may have lived that out in very, very different ways, but what has generally been commonly understood by society is that if we're going to thrive, we have to have a high regard for life. Now, I would modify that statement in this way. That is that if society is going to thrive, the people of that society must have a high regard for all human life. Now, as soon as I bring that word all into the conversation with regard to human life, we are now talking about something that is not purely secular, worldly, or common to every person. We are now talking about something that has a religious sense to it. And the reason for that is because if the universe is purely material, right? Like, you remove God, the supernatural, the spiritual, you take all of what is believed in terms of the immaterial on the part of those who are religious or spiritual. You remove all that and you leave yourself with a purely material universe. There's no reason to actually hold to the idea that the people of a society must have a high regard for all human life. You don't have to accept that. In fact, the logic of that probably falls apart. What you need to do is you need to have a high regard for the kinds of human life that are wanted or desired, right? Or that benefit the interests of that society. Again, if you're talking about a purely material universe, what you're mostly interested in are the kinds of human life that are wanted, that are desirable, that benefit the interests of that society. As soon as you move from that to this place where all human life is to be regarded as having a high degree of sanctity, you're now making a sort of religious statement, which you may or may not agree with. A question that I'd like for us to consider this morning is, has our devotion as a people, right? You can think of this as a church, as a religious people, but probably more broadly as a society, as the world. Has our devotion to the sanctity of all human life, has it evolved over time? Has it devolved over time? Or has it basically just stayed the same, but maybe changed parts? I think you'd find people can make arguments for practically any one of these three conclusions, right? There'd be those that would consider the context of the world in which we live and compare that with other contexts of the world that had been experienced beforehand and say, we've come a long way in our appreciation for and our regard for the sanctity of human life. Others would look and say, here's the reasons why I think we've actually gone backwards in our regard for the sanctity of life, right? And then there might be some who just say, well, I think that really what we're experiencing is maybe just a changing of the terms, but ultimately, like, we as human beings are still struggling, in fact, with having overall a high degree for the sanctity of human life. Now, you consider the situation we find ourselves in, right? And you compare the situation we find ourselves in, or the world that we experience in 2023 in the United States of America. It's very easy to picture other societies in other parts of the world, or that occurred in other times of human history. It's easy to picture them as being more barbaric than we are. Consider, for instance, the violence of ancient and medieval times, where One person could kill another person simply for being dishonored by that person. Think about the tribal conflicts that have been experienced throughout human history, still are experienced even today, where people consider it okay, morally justified, to kill people from another tribe. I don't know how many fans of old westerns, but you think about whatever western or frontier life was like. We know it was pretty harsh, right? But there was this idea that it's like every person for themselves, and oftentimes life was not considered to have as much sanctity as maybe we do today. I think about the histories of religious wars, holy wars, political wars. Think about the criminal and drug empires, the racial and ethnic holocausts that have existed, again, in many different times and in many different places. And it might be easy, again, for the way in which we experience the world to think, oh my goodness, we have come so far, we're doing so much better. But I would suggest that every society, pretty much, I imagine there are certainly some exemptions, some exclusions to this general rule, but practically every society has had disregard for unwanted forms of human life, right? And this is kind of the key concept in understanding what it means to actually uphold and appreciate and hold with a high degree of sanctity this thing called human life. Right? Practically every society has had some disregard for unwanted forms of human life. In a supremacist kind of society, it might be that the unwanted forms of human life were people of a different race, of a different color or culture. In societies that were ruled by religious fundamentalists, which would include all major religions of the world, at least segments of them from time to time, including Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, you name it practically. But the idea here is the unwanted forms of humans are those who are of a different religion or of no religion at all. Right? Other kinds of unwanted human persons are that we have seen throughout our history are unwanted children, right? That was a category of humans that could be considered as undesirable, unwanted, and therefore not worthy of being preserved and protected. Unwanted and unborn children, people with physical disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, sexual minorities, the elderly, those who are non-producing, people who are dissenters of the elite and ruling class, and probably some others that I haven't even thought of. And so again, the question is, have we made progress, or have we only changed the lines that are drawn between the categories of wanted and unwanted human beings? So now let's look at the commandment, right? Do not murder, right? That's the commandment that we're looking at. This command is, I think it's important for us to understand primarily what was intended behind the commandment as it was given to the nation of Israel by God. The construction of the commandment is just two Hebrew words, and the construction of these words have the force, literally, of never murder, right? That would be a good translation for these two Hebrew words. Never murder. That is, this is not a temporary injunction that we're talking about that endures only for a particular period of time or place, but rather this is intended for all time and in all places, right? Never murder. Now, it does have a very specific meaning. Some of you probably memorized, when you memorized the Ten Commandments as a child, in the King James version of the Bible, which says, thou shalt not kill, right? Thou shalt not kill. At the time that the King James Version came about, thou shalt not kill had probably a fairly specific meaning in the English language for those that were reading it at that time, so much that they were able to discern between the kind of killing or murder that was being talked about in the commandment as opposed to other kinds of killing. For instance, the commandment is not prohibiting all kinds of killing. It is not prohibiting the killing of animals, for instance. It is not prohibiting the killing that happens in war, or even the kind of killing that might happen in the administering of capital punishment, right? It's specifically talking about murder. Murder, a specific kind of unlawful killing of another human being. That's the commandment, okay? Again, I just want for us to understand the command in the context in which it was given. It spoke to the kind of killing that you might describe as a violent killing of a personal enemy. That would certainly fall into the category of murder. A premeditated killing, a killing that was done in cold blood. It would even refer to perhaps what we might describe as manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter that was due to some kind of negligence or something like that. But again, it's specifically honing in on this idea of what we would most commonly associate with murder. When we think about what is murder, right, the commandment, the injunction here is do not murder. Now, we're not going to get into questions of whether or not there is such a thing as just war. When we talk about the wars of this world, we're not going to talk about whether or not it's ever permissible for a government to engage, in war or to carry out tactical operations or even to administer capital punishment for capital crimes. We're not going to talk about those things. You can talk about those things on your way home in the car today. Important conversations, but how many of you want to be here for the next 2-3 hours, right? And it would take even longer to really, really unpack any of those particular things. So focusing on this idea of never murder, do not murder, what does this mean for us, right? What does this commandment mean for us? I'd like to talk about, very briefly, some ethical considerations for the Christian, okay? If you're a follower of Christ, this isn't everything that you could ever think about when it comes to the sanctity of life, but they are some things. They are some things that I would suggest to you as something for you to consider, right? Again, I'll call them ethical considerations for the Christian that you may agree with, you may disagree with, you may not know what to do with them. But I'd like to just talk about a few things, and then maybe we can look at how perhaps we have missed the mark in actually living up to the commandment to never murder, and what we might do about it. All right. The first ethical consideration for the Christian that I would have you consider is this: Jesus' empire and the empires of this world are not the same thing. Jesus' empire and the empires of this world are not the same thing, okay? These two things, the Bible uses the language in most of our translation of kingdoms. We don't really have a lot of kingdoms in our contemporary society, but I think we do understand the concept of empire. The United States of America could be considered a kind of empire. Other nations could be considered empires, right? And Jesus says, my empire, my kingdom is not of this world. It is not like the kingdoms of this world. And so the empire of Jesus and the empires of the world are not the same thing. So to that I would say this: governments, right, the governments of this world, the governments that govern the empires in which we find ourselves living, they're going to do what governments are going to do. From time to time, those governments will declare war on other governments. They will involve themselves in the affairs of other nations, because governments do that kind of thing. What I'm interested in for us as a follower of Jesus is the church. And I would just say the church has no right, has no prerogative to declare war, ever. Whenever we consider the history of the church, and at times the church and the government were so closely intertwined with one another that they were basically inseparable, you'll find the church going to war against other peoples. And I would say that is wholly and entirely inappropriate, immoral, unethical. The church has no business involving itself in the wars of this world for whatever reason. Neither do I think the church has the right to administer justice for supposed crimes, right? Another thing that the church has as a part of its history is, from time to time, treating certain offenses as capital offenses and taking the lives of human beings for offending those particular rules or laws. The church has no place in this, right? You think about the famous witch trials, right, that were once part of the religious narrative, where people were tried for the crime of witchcraft and were put to death for that, right? The church has no business in any of that, right? So the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of Jesus are not the same thing, right? The church has a certain realm, a certain sphere over which it is to be concerned. And as soon as it begins to move outside of what it should be immediately and solely concerned with, it has trespassed the boundaries for which it is intended. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world," okay? That is something that I hope that we as a community of faith, like I'm specifically talking to the Curtis Lakers here this morning, I just pray we get this so deeply entrenched in our hearts that the kingdom of Jesus, the empire of Jesus, of which we are a part, is wholly and distinctly separate from the kingdoms of this world, okay? Number two, this is a weird one. It's going to sound kind of strange, so let me just say it and then try to explain it a little bit. This is an ethical consideration for the follower of Jesus, right? And to that I would say, it is better to be killed than to kill. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun, does it? We might ask, certain questions like, what about, anytime you talk about taking the life of another person, like, what about self-defense? And I don't want to get into all of the various kind of things that come into whether or not a person is morally justified to defend themselves. I think as great a case to say you are morally justified can be made as the case that, well, we should be willing to die rather than take the life of another person, right? Again, just an ethical consideration for us to think about as a framework for how we understand and preserve the sanctity of life. Jesus goes on to say, if my kingdom were of this world, right? So now Jesus, he brings us into the realm of the imaginary. He says, listen, if my kingdom were in fact of this world, then my servants, right? The people that were following him, his disciples, the people that were following his teachings, trying to live out his way, his ethic. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, right? Because that's what the kingdoms of this world do. They fight, they jockey for position, they try to hold, maintain, and preserve their own power and their self-interests, right? My servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews, right? So Jesus is saying this is how it would go down. If we were in fact talking about just another kingdom of the world, of which I was becoming the king, right, then my people that are following me, they'd be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, he says again, my kingdom is not from here. Number 3, revenge after the fact is prohibited. Revenge after the fact is prohibited. We find ourselves in situations sometimes where we have moved beyond that place where there may be active and present danger for which we may be wrestling with the ethic of, do I protect myself, in this particular case by taking the life of another individual? Well, let's just say we've moved beyond that, right? And so the threat has been removed, and now you have an offending party who's still drawing breath. What do you do with that person? Again, we're not interested in how governments are going to do what governments are going to do. We're talking about ethical considerations for the follower of Jesus, right? And it seems very, very clear. In fact, you have to do a lot of biblical gymnastics to get around the idea that revenge after the fact is prohibited. That is, that when there is not an active and present danger in force, on the part of as a personal individual, for me to go after somebody that has done harm to me as an act of revenge would be prohibited. Paul says, friends, do not avenge yourselves. Do not avenge yourselves. Instead, leave room for God's wrath, because it is written, vengeance belongs to me, I will repay, says the Lord. How many of you from time to time step out beyond your pay grade? At work or in life, right? You ever found yourself saying, that is above my pay grade? Do you know that when it comes to vengeance, that is above the pay grade of the follower of Jesus? It says here that vengeance is a property that belongs to God. And it is God's prerogative to administer justice, who, by the way, when he administers justice, he always does it absolutely perfectly every single time. And so he relieves me, a fallen human being, he relieves me of the pressure of having to figure out how best to administer justice. Paul says, do not avenge yourselves, but leave room for God's wrath. Number 4, Christians should seek the welfare of all human life, wanted and unwanted. The follower of Jesus should seek the welfare of all human life, wanted and unwanted. For the individual Christian, right, for you and for me, those of us that are aspiring to follow in the footsteps of Jesus and the ethic of Jesus, we should, I believe, subscribe to a kind of nonviolence with the way in which we lead our lives, and to a high view of preserving all human life from conception to natural death. That should be the prevailing ethic. There's an alternative view, right? I introduced this at the beginning. The alternative view is this. We as human beings, we came from nothing. We are here for no particular reason, and we're not heading anywhere. And so therefore, we should do whatever is in our best interest to do when it comes to how we treat life. But the truth is, and this is what Christians believe, we didn't come from nowhere or nothing. We came from God. And we were made in God's image. Right? We're not here for no purpose, but rather we were created for a divine purpose. And we are certainly not headed for nowhere, because we are, and it has been determined that we will stand before God as our judge. The psalmist said, for it was you, speaking of God, for it was you who created my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb, and I will praise you because I have been remarkably and wondrously made. I am wondrously made. As a human being, I am wondrously made. But guess what? So is every other person. Every other person. The empires of this world are always going to have their categories of unwanted humans. If you look hard enough, you will find categories of unwanted humans the empires of this world are eager to dismiss. But the Christian should never have any such category. Number 5, murder is about more than murder. Murder is about more than murder. Many of you are familiar with the New Testament, New Covenant ethic that Jesus invites us into with regard to murder, right? That most of us would say we are not guilty of. And Jesus reminds us in Matthew chapter 5, you have heard that it was said to our ancestors, do not murder, right? There's the commandment, do not murder. And that whoever murders will be subject to judgment. You know what the judgment for murder was? If you were found guilty of murder, then you were guilty of a capital crime and you were punished with the death penalty, right? So the commandment is do not murder. Whoever murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, here's Jesus. Now, Jesus, he overlays this command with an ethic of the heart. And he says, but I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. So murder is about more than murder, right? Jesus here, he begins this conversation about something like anger. Have you ever been so angry with somebody that you wish they were dead? Anybody? What's wrong with you? Right? Like, what is that? Right? Jesus is speaking to this spirit in us, this attitude in us, that while we may not have the power or the opportunity to take the life of another person, the feelings that we have toward that person are tantamount to murder. Why? Well, because there's a kind of anger that we can be subject to that cuts us off from another person. We have used the expression to describe this, right? That person is as good as dead to me. There's a kind of anger that can take life from someone else. Right? It doesn't have to be expressed fully in the violence of murder where a person's life has been snuffed out. There are things that we can do, and there are ways in which we can be complicit in the taking of life from another person as a result of our anger. Am I guilty of yelling, of verbal abuse at home? At my workplace? See, Jesus, he elevates the command to beyond those actions that lead directly to an individual's death, right? He is bringing into the conversation such things as bitterness and hatred and destructive language, of bullying, domineering control, of blowing up, of jealousy, of this out of control kind of temper. Because all these things, they fail to uphold the commandment that's intended to preserve life, right? The commandment, do not murder, is intended to preserve life. And there are things that we can do short of murder that actually compromise the preservation of life. So anger can approach murder in the heart. So what do we do? Let me just share with you a few things with regard to this commandment. What should we do? And let me start with this thing that we just talked about in the expression of anger. We need to learn how to express anger in a way that isn't destructive. Okay, when we're talking about anger and how that relates to the taking of life of another person, we need to learn how to express anger in a way that isn't destructive. Truth is, we're all going to have anger. In fact, anger is an emotion that is an important part of our human experience, right? Anger, properly managed and dealt with, has benefits for our life because of how it moves us to change what is wrong. So we need to understand anger. We need to admit our anger. Like, where does this anger come from? Well, anger is generally produced because you have a need. And when that need um, is understood, there is an expectation that follows where that need is going to be fulfilled. And then when that expectation isn't met, for whatever reason, you experience hurt. And so what happens is, as a result of that hurt, anger comes in because it covers and keeps us from feeling our hurt. How many of you love feeling hurt? No, we don't love feeling hurt. So what do? Some of us, we solve our hurt by allowing anger to come in and cover it over and keep us from actually feeling it. Anger will destroy someone else as it lingers, right? Because it's not been properly dealt with, as it lingers and ferments into hatred, right? This is the kind of anger whose trajectory Jesus seems to be indicating is murder, though murder may never happen. The trajectory of this kind of anger is murder, right? Because it is anger that is fermented and lingered and has become hatred. And the only remedy is forgiveness. We have to learn how to express anger in a way that isn't destructive, either to other people or to ourselves. Some of you would probably be able to tell stories of how anger, how bitterness has had a devastating effect on you, right? Because you didn't express it in a way that is healthy. If we don't do that, you know what happens to our anger? Our anger is going to find an outlet somewhere. It's just like electricity, right? Lightning strikes a building, right? It wants to make its way. It's going to find some way, right, to get from one place to another. Our anger does the same thing. And so if our anger is not dealt with in a way that is healthy, our body's going to absorb it, for instance, right? This is why people experience all kinds of health problems as a result of their anger, their bitterness. Learn how to express anger in a way that isn't destructive. Next thing I would encourage you to think about is to consider the pathway of nonviolence. Consider the pathway of nonviolence. Violent solutions are easy when you're powerful and when you're loaded with weapons. Okay? As soon as we start to talk about like nonviolent solutions to conflict, many of us, given the particular context in which we live, we struggle in our imagination to see how that could be a better way. Why? Oh, because we have great military force. Because we are loaded to bear, right? I mean, we've got weapons enough to destroy the entire world if we wanted to, right? And so it's very easy, given our technological advance, our military might, right, the position that we happen to hold at this particular time, it's easy for us to think that violent solutions are the best solutions. But again, moving away from the conversation of what governments are going to do, because governments are going to do what governments are going to do, for the Christian, for the follower of Jesus, I think it is absolutely imperative that we consider the pathway of nonviolence. This is a really, really difficult thing, again, for our imagination to grapple onto because our experience has been so different from that. Third, avoid complicity in the destruction of life. Avoid complicity in the destruction of life, right? This is just a simple question of like, am I complicit in how other lives are being destroyed? You wouldn't like to think so. I mean, I don't want to think so. But are my lifestyle habits, are my spending habits, are things that I'm doing in my life that I think are quite innocent and very, very removed from any kind of unjust or unrighteous behavior or attitudes towards someone else, are they actually, in fact, complicit in the destruction of life? We might also ask ourselves, what am I allowing into my spirit? What am I allowing into my life, into my spirit? What am I allowing my eyes to see and my ears to hear? We're all being formed into something, right? Every one of us right now. You can believe this or not believe this, but we are all being formed into something. And the things that we invite and bring into our lives, they influence us in the sense that they form us into something. And so we have to ask ourselves, like, what am I allowing into my life? I'm not going to make any particular prohibitions on, what rating of movie you should watch, what genre of movie you should or should not watch. We're not going to get into the legalistic aspects of trying to govern every single area of a person's life. I'm just asking you to ask yourself the question, what am I inviting into my life? The shows and the movies that I'm watching that maybe glorify something like murder. The video games that simulate gross violence toward other humans. All right, people would be very, very quick who are engaged in any of these things to say, oh, that doesn't have any effect on me. Right? I can play this game for hours and hours and hours. It doesn't have any effect on me. Really? Really? Okay. I mean, I guess we'll agree to disagree, right? We're being formed. Am I guilty of passive inaction, right? We're talking about the complicity of the destruction of life. Are there ways in which my passive inaction, when I have the opportunity to maybe do good, is my passive inaction making me culpable in the destruction of life? And finally with this, I'd say, do we find ourselves celebrating death or grieving over it? When some really, really bad, wicked, evil person has committed some particular atrocity and they are brought to justice, and that justice ultimately results in the death of that individual, are we on the front lines applauding, right, the victory, the celebration of the death of that person who will no longer be able to inflict harm or death on anybody else? I feel like our posture probably should be something more of grief. Grief over, certainly, the victims of those atrocities that were committed, but grief over every life. Grief over the lives that are lost in war, both on the opposing side and on, quote unquote, your side. And finally, and I close with this, embrace God's vision for life. Embrace God's vision for life. Jesus says, I have come to give life. Right? Did you know God loves life? He loves it. He is madly in love with life. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, he said to Adam and Eve following his creation of the first man and woman. God loves life. And we need to embrace the vision that God has for the life of all. This has to be a church where we value the life of every individual. This will not be a place that divides between those who are wanted and those who are unwanted. We need to embrace God's vision for life.